Hi everyone, welcome to HeadSpin webinar. I'm Joe Chasinga, a software engineer with HeadSpin. I'm working on device instrumentation and also the Biometrics SDK for both the iOS and Android platforms. And today we're gonna be talking about the Android Biometrics SDK. Sorry about that. And how to use the library package to effectively run your biometric test. So let's start with talking about what is really a biometric. Biometric is the use of user's body measurements and calculations as metrics or keys and authentication, identification, or control. The most common forms used today would be fingerprint scanning, that's really popular, face recognition, iris scanning, and then like skeleton detection, as you might have seen with the Xbox Kinect sensors. And here's a little reference from quite a popular film, Back to the Future 2. That was back in 1989, 30 years ago. In the movie, it envisioned that in 2015, we would be using fingerprint to access all the doors and instead of doorknobs or locks, and even use it for paying taxi or Ubers for that matters. And obviously, we've been lagging behind just a little bit, but we're getting there somehow. So here comes the issues with automating biometric tests on Android. The obvious problem here is it's quite impossible to interact with or sidestep the biometric prompt in the test flow without a physical intervention, obviously, because it's not trivial or even possible to programmatically intervene with the secure processor that stores the raw fingerprint data or the fingerprint scanner hardware. So that's really a problem, right? That's really obvious. There is the huge gig economies around clicking mobile devices. They're called click farms, and they're all over the world, in many parts of the world. And however, I don't think it's a good idea to have a gig worker run her fingerprint on the apps that we want to test, right? So let's dive into very high level flow of biometric process in Android here. It usually start with either a full view activity or a dialog component in the UI. And usually it's triggered by some kind of user interaction, like tapping on a button or changing to a new activity. And then it runs the fingerprint manager that implicitly talk to the fingerprint service that runs in the background. And then the service will communicate with the fingerprint scanner hardware. Let's see how that works out. Here you can see that programmatically, when the UI is loaded, is gonna instantiate the fingerprint manager, or either it's gonna ask for the readiness of the fingerprint manager. And afterward, when we call authenticate method on this instance of fingerprint manager and pass along the relevant parameters like the crypto object and callback object, it will implicitly talk to the fingerprint service. And then the service will ask the fingerprint scanner to warm itself up. What that means is the scanner will start running and polling for the user's fingerprint. And once there's the fingerprint here, as you can see here, a nice dark fingerprint impression here is captured properly by the scanner. Just so you know, there's a few conditions when the fingerprint impression might not be registering properly. Like for instance, the scanner is dirty or the angle of the impression is not really optimal. But that being said, when the sensor gets a pretty good impression of a fingerprint, it will validate the fingerprint with the one that's stored in another part of Android called the trust zone, which is which is an isolated hardware with its own operating system, and it can never be accessed directly from Android. And once everything is validated, it's going to return a result to the service, and then the service will tell the fingerprint manager to run the relevant handler or callback based on the result that's passed back here. Either it's on succeeded, it can be on fail, or it can be on error. In the case of on succeeded, the action is likely to dismiss the UI prompt or the dialog, and then maybe fetch the user's data from the database or the device cache, and then populate the next activity with the data, and then move the user to the next activity, creating the sense of the user being signed in. With on fail or on error, a good fallback or a good default would be to show a prompt or maybe a toast that tell the user about the error or the failure. And always make sure to provide a good feedback and graceful fallback in the case of failure or error, so that the user knows where to go to just input the username, email, or the password. So here's the little video demo of myself testing out a test app here called the Health Test. It doesn't do much, but just enough. Whenever we tap a login button, it's going to display a dialog asking for the fingerprint. And once it can validate a fingerprint, it will just dismiss the dialog. Okay, let's see what happens here. Looks like it's taking a while to run. Okay, here it is. So at this point, I am tapping the login button, and then I am going to use my finger to lock in, and that's it. Okay, obviously there's some audio there. I recorded this last night. Hopefully it's clear to you all. I can just repeat it. See, there's the dialog here, and then by using my enroll fingerprint, I can dismiss it. It's a very simple flow, but it's a flow that's normally not easily automated. So here's another video demo of the same app, but this time it used our HeadSpin fingerprint SDK or Biometric SDK. There's no fingerprint involved here. All I'm doing is sending a post request with, as you can see here, I censor out my token, but it's the post request with a payload here. And that's the prompt. And then again, it returns 200 status code, success true. Let me repeat it. And then it just dismissed the prompt. Once again, Apologize for the extra audio, but you get the picture. So before we go on and talk about how to install this awesome library, be reminded that this only works with Android API level 23 and later. This is not specific to the library. It's just the versions or the ones that support fingerprint feature. And then secondly, the test device should have a valid fingerprint enrolled. The SDK is not doing anything magical, so the target device needs to be able to authenticate with real fingerprint. And last but not least, this goes without saying, do not distribute your test bill in the wild. You run the risk of somebody hijacking your user's biometric using external connection. So please, we recommend only using our test bill with our highly secure devices. So without further ado, let's head over to headspin.io settings page here. If you are already our existing customer, you should be able to get access to the download link and the documentation link, which talk in more detail about what we are discussing right now. Then head over to your Android Studio editor. Hopefully, this is how your Android Studio environment will look like for most of you guys. First of all, create a directory called source main and /libs under your apps directory. So this is pretty optional. And if you already know what you're doing, you don't have to do it. Just make sure you have a nice safe directory for the library. And then you add the downloaded instruments-release.aar file to the newly created libs directory. Again, it can be an indirect directory. And in your app modules build.gradle, add this line here, implementation, name instruments-release, extension AAR under dependencies block. And last but not least, sometime your environment might not be able to find the library. In that case, add this flat door doors and then provide it with your libraries directory under repositories block. And you should be good to go. Okay, so now let's walk through some code. There you go. So this is the code for the fingerprint dialog fragment. It's the code for the UI that you've seen previously on the test app. It's the part that flash out the biometrics dialog. These are all pretty standard, really up to how you write your code. Please notice here, the tool line here, for your test bill to integrate our biometrics SDK, import io.headspin.instruments.hs fingerprint manager. So io.headspin.instruments is the package name. And it's helpful to also import HS fingerprint auth callback, which is the helper, sort of like a helpful wrapper around the original authentication callback that provide useful defaults for all the cases that you may get from the authentication process. Okay, and now let's go through the class. You'll notice here, I actually defined HSFingerprint manager variable here early within the class. And I also define my custom callback here that inherits the HSFingerprint auth callback that I imported from the library. So as you can see here, I only care about customizing the authentication succeeded case. So I only override this method here. And what I wanted to do is to just dismiss the dialog. So that's what I'm exactly doing here. And I don't really care about on fail or on error. So this HSFingerprint auth callback, it provides defaults. It's gonna display a toast with some helpful message of the failure or the error. But of course, you can still override those. Okay, let's move on. Here, in the onAttach method here, this gets run when the view is loaded, or the dialog in this case is loaded. This is where you usually want to instantiate your HSFingerprint manager instance and assign it to your HSFingerprint manager variable. So if you are using if you're using an activity instead of a dialog, so the method is probably going to be on created or something else. But the concept here is the same. You want to instantiate HSFingerprint manager when the view gets loaded. Moving on here. On detach, this is the equivalent to an activities on destroy method. So before we clean up, we close up the view, we want to clean up the HSFingerprint manager with close method. What this does is it clean up any TCP connection in the background that is doing the communication with the external, or in this case, HeadSpin platform HTTP server. And this is the onCreate dialog method. So we actually assign our custom callback to a helper. And then this is where we create a crypto object. And then this is a very important part. We call authenticate method on the HSFingerprint manager, and then pass the crypto object, and then the handler or the callback as parameters. Remember, this is the part when it starts to warm up the fingerprint scanner. So when you call this, it's gonna load up the scanner, and the scanner will start to pull for the fingerprint from the user. Let's see. These are where you actually set some useful message and some button styling. So the majority of the code here is going to be about creating the relevant key and in order to create the a secure crypto object. And we won't get into that, but please make sure you don't copy this algorithms here, because they are not recommended for production. And yada, yada, yada. These are all about generating keys, very standard. Something to note here, you might want to check for the permission first. If your device has the permission to use the fingerprint at all, otherwise there's no use to authenticate. You should just provide a meaningful toast with the message to the user. And this is how you actually test if there's any enrolled fingerprints on your device. If none, you better just flash a toast with a message, something like register at least one fingerprint in the settings of the device. Okay, let's get back to our slides. So if there's anything else that is unclear to you and you want to get more information, please feel free to consult our awesome documentation. And that's it. That concludes our webinar for today. We have a couple of minutes, extra minutes actually, for the Q&A session. So I am gonna check for some question here. Oh, by the way, now is the time if you're interested. You can get in touch with us. Head over to headspin.io /contact. In touch with us and use this promo code here you see on the slide and include in the message to get your free trial now. Here comes the questions. Does this library work with Java project? Yes, it does. Actually, Kotlin and Java are very interchangeable. They are very compatible. So you could use this AAR library without change to your code. Another one here is how to download the library. If you're already an existing customer, you should be able to get access to the SDK. But if you are not, or if you don't have the access, please get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to help. Get in contact our sales to get started here. Another here, how to get more of these webinars? Good question. I'm glad you like it. We listen to you as the audience, and we would appreciate some feedback. And the more interest and signups we get early on, the more we will want to keep producing for our customers and everyone else. There's one more question here. Is this library secure? Programmatically, programmers wise, it is, because it is just a wrapper around the original fingerprint manager, which means that what was working there is when you actually call authenticate method, it just pass along the wrapper just pass along the crypto object and the callback to the to the real fingerprint process, authentication process. So there's no magic there. However, the wrapper itself actually create a TCP connection to the outside world. So it is highly recommended that you do not use your test bill in public, and only trust HeadSpin and use it on one of our devices, because the SDK will work out of the box with our platform, our infrastructure, and the API endpoints. So with that, I'd like to thank you everyone for joining today. Thanks for your time and questions, and I'm open to feedback in the future. Please stay tuned for more HeadSpin webinars coming up in the next few weeks. There's one about Apple TV OS, which is a very up-and-coming feature that we are supporting. Really interesting. Another is about doing Appium testing with React Native. Of course, this is exciting because React Native is actually leveraging the power of web technology in the mobile world, and it's actually opening up for a lot of web developers to get on board in the mobile development. And there's also another one about load testing, which is pretty good. And just keep in mind that we are really customer centric, and we are focusing on helping you all succeed. Build killer and reliable apps that would delight your users. And so please do not hesitate to talk to us, and we might be able to help. Again, thank you for everyone for joining, and looking forward to seeing you all again, or seeing you all in the next webinars. Please do not forget this promo code right here on the slide if you are interested in getting a free trial with us. And thank you all for today.